Hello, welcome back to Bio 23 Introduction to Infectious Disease, Chapter 5. We're going to be talking about the microbial world and learning more about microbial diversity in this section. First thing we need to go over is a little better understanding of what life is and what living things actually consist of. All life on Earth is comprised of cells, and cells are considered the basic unit of life, first discovered and observed by Robert Hooke in 1665, if you remember from previous lectures. His discovery and subsequent discoveries over the next few hundred years led to the development of the cell theory, which is a fundamental concept in biology. The tenets of the cell theory are essential for understanding what life is. Your book lists 4 of them, the first of which is that all organisms are comprised of cells. So if it's a living thing, it must be made of cells. All organisms are either unicellular or multicellular, either comprised of single cells or many cells. All cells are fundamentally alike and have similar structure and metabolism. And finally, cells arise only from previously existing cells. This concept of life begets life opposes what was previously well understood and accepted by the scientific community prior to Louis Pasteur and the concept of spontaneous generation. However, in the last few hundred years, scientists have disproved spontaneous generation and now accept that the only way life can occur or exist on Earth is coming from previously existing life. The cell theory does not apply to some categories of microorganisms, such as viruses and prions. Viruses and prions are considered to be molecular particles, not cells. And since they are not cells, then they are not considered alive. The biggest reason why they're not cells is related to that third concept in the cell theory, which is that all cells are fundamentally alike with regard to structure and metabolism. Viruses and prions are not considered alive because they are lacking some of the cellular structures that are found in all cells on Earth. For instance, they do not all contain DNA. They do not all contain a membrane. In fact, prions lack them entirely. And most viruses don't contain membranes either. And almost exclusively, there are no viruses and no prions that contain any ribosomes. And these are all characteristics found in all cells on Earth. So from now on, we're going to try to refer to viruses and prions as being infectious particles, rather than being alive or cells. However, it's not uncommon for biologists, and especially microbiologists, to refer to microbes and microorganisms, including viruses and prions. And that's just for ease of use. A major property of life is the ability to constantly satisfy the requirement for energy. Processing and taking in energy is an essential component of all living systems. This is because all life, as a property of the second law of thermodynamics, is constantly losing energy into the universe. So in order to just stay alive and maintain organization, all life must constantly take in and process energy. Organisms take in and process energy in different ways. Some take in energy in the form of organic compounds. This would be like food, primarily sugars or fats, and very rarely this could also include proteins. This is how you take in energy. The energy is then processed into a different form of molecule referred to as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This energy currency of the cell is how the cell uses energy. So it takes in energy in the form of sugars and fats, and then produces another molecule that's energy rich, ATP, which it uses directly for lots of cellular processes. These organisms that engage in this type of metabolism are referred to as heterotrophs. Hetero means other, and troph is feed. And that's because the location or where these organisms obtain their energy is from other organisms. The sugars and fats that our cells consume come from other organisms that make it for us. Other organisms obtain energy from non-living sources. These are referred to as autotrophs. Autotrophs do not require other living things, but rather make their own energy-rich molecules from non-living energy sources. One type of autotroph are photosynthetic autotrophs, which obtain energy from the sun. Others derive energy from the metabolism of inorganic compounds. These are referred to as chemosynthetic autotrophs, sometimes called rock eaters, because it's almost like they are consuming rock. But really, what they're doing is obtaining energy in the form of energy-rich electrons from inorganic, non-living, rocky materials. While heterotrophs are dependent on autotrophs for energy, autotrophs could live by themselves with no other living systems to help them. There are other characteristics that are found in all living things. This is listed in Table 5.1 in your text. Here, there's the discussion about cellular organization, which we talked about with the cell theory. Also, energy production, which we just finished discussing. All life also requires reproduction, responding to internal and external stimuli, which your book refers to as irritability, and all life is also required to grow and develop. In this picture here, figure 5.1 in your text, your book goes through the energy requirements that we just talked about. How autotrophs can obtain energy in one of two main ways, either solar energy, in which case they're photosynthetic autotrophs, or inorganic chemical energy like rocks, in which case they're chemosynthetic autotrophs. The autotrophs then produce organic molecules that can be obtained or stolen by heterotrophs. The heterotrophs then, in their metabolism, use the energy from those organic molecules and produce non-toxic byproducts, inorganic molecules like carbon dioxide and water, which are then reused by the autotrophs to store chemical energy again that they trapped from the sun or rocks. There are other characteristics that we find in living systems. One other one that I'd like to mention that's mentioned in your book is that microbes vary in their requirement for oxygen. We're going to be using some of these terms subsequent chapters, so I'd like you to be familiar with them. Organisms, microorganisms in particular, don't always require oxygen for survival like we do. If an organism is considered an aerobic organism, that means that they require oxygen for metabolic activities, and without oxygen, they would die. However, there is an important group of bacteria that are referred to as strict or obligate anaerobes. And anaerobes do not require oxygen for their metabolism and survival, and in fact, are killed if exposed to oxygen gas. So generally, they must be buried in the soil, deep in the oceans or lakes or swamps, or located within the inside tissues of multicellular organisms. There's another class of anaerobic microbes referred to as facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes are actually aerobic. They love living in oxygen, and they would prefer it for their metabolism. However, in the absence of oxygen gas, they don't die. They can survive for short periods of time, replicating slowly in the absence of oxygen gas. The knowledge of the oxygen requirements of pathogens is really important when understanding infectious disease. If there are any infections that are suspected to be anaerobic, strictly anaerobic or obligate anaerobic cells, then those cells and their samples must be transported without oxygen. Otherwise, those cells could die. Now that we have a little better understanding about what life is, let's talk a little bit more about microbial life. All life on Earth can be classified into one of two major cell types. That's the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The biggest difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is the presence or absence of a nucleus. Both cells, in fact, all cells on Earth, contain DNA. The difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is that in prokaryotic cells, the DNA is not surrounded by a membrane. Instead, that DNA floats freely inside the cytoplasm in a region called the nucleoid. In eukaryotic cells, the DNA is surrounded by a membrane and thus is called the nucleus. So prokaryotic cells existed before the nucleus evolved. There are other differences between these cell types, but the biggest difference is whether or not they have a nucleus or a membrane-bound DNA structure. Other differences are that prokaryotic cells are smaller in general than eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells do not have organelles or internal structures like eukaryotes do. And prokaryotes are all unicellular organisms, whereas eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular. Here we have some pictures showing you the differences between the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. They are, of course, not to scale because the prokaryotic cells would be much smaller, but you can see how the eukaryotic cells over here have many more internal structures that are membrane-bound and have specialized functions. These are called organelles, and we'll be talking about these later. Prokaryotic cells, on the other hand, can engage in most of the same functions that the eukaryotic cells can, but they do all of their functions inside the cytoplasm of the cell. In the next section, we're going to talk about the evolution and diversity of microbial life on Earth.